Alright, so we're getting into our second video of chapter 2, which we're getting into chemical bonds. Again, this is hopefully somewhat review for you, as we're going to be covering some things that we've covered in other classes, such as covalent bonds, ionic bonds, hydrogen bonds, and then talking about examples of each, and then getting into things like the properties of water and why water is so necessary for living things. So just a review on some terminology, right? Atom and basic unit of the element, we talked about that last video. Ions, which are atoms that have gained or lost electrons. And then molecules are going to be where you have two or more atoms coming together, they're forming a bond. And compounds is where it's basically like a molecule, except you have two or more elements. So for example, H2O, water, and sodium chloride would be compounds, but oxygen gas, or O2, would not be a compound because O2 is two oxygens, so we only have one element present. So here's just a breakdown kind of showing you, if we're looking at a substance, what are some of the terms we can use to describe things. So element versus a compound. You can pause here and take a look at this. I'm going to go ahead and move on because there's things that I care about more than this. The things that I care about the most are right here, the types of bonds. Because the different types of bonds, they matter in terms of giving us certain properties for the molecules, whether or not they will interact with water or not. These are going to be things that are important for Biology 22, for physio. So let's go ahead and talk about these three different types of bonds that we care about. We have covalent bonds. Covalent bonds are going to share electrons. Ionic bonds, which are going to give or take electrons. And if you're looking at the slide, you see that E minus. That E minus is an electron. And then hydrogen bonds, where we are going to share the electrons, but not 100% equally. So think covalent bonds. We are thinking we are equally sharing, right, electrons, right? If it's a pure non-polar covalent bond, we are sharing the electrons, but we are sharing them perfectly equally. Ionic bonds, we have given an electron over completely, or we have taken an electron completely. And then the hydrogen bonds, we are sharing electrons, but it's not completely fair. So it's also sometimes called a polar bond because one of the atoms is kind of hogging the electrons a little bit closer to themselves. If we look at the relative strength, in general, it tends to follow what we see down here. Covalent, ionic, and then hydrogen bonds being the weakest. And so let's go ahead and talk about some of the things that are important for each of these. So let's start with the ionic bond, where we are talking about creating ions, right? Because we're giving or taking electrons. If we have given away an electron, we are a cation. And if we have received an electron, we are an anion. So in this case, we're looking at sodium chloride. And so sodium would be the cation, chloride would be the anion. And this is when we have this ionic bond, a lot of times we're talking about forming what's called a salt. Now, a salt, if it's in a solvent like water, the two individual atoms can dissociate from each other. They will remain as ions, so they'll keep the electrons that they took, or they won't take back the ones they gave away, but they'll dissolve in the water. And this is what, when we have this case where we have these ions dissolved in the water, we call these ions now electrolytes. We care a lot about electrolytes because we use these on a lot of different physiological processes. So we want to keep this in mind of what an electrolyte is, right? Again, it's just an ion dissolved in a solvent like water. We're going to see that term come back a lot, right? And you may have heard, about like an electrolyte imbalance. What does that mean? It means you don't have the right balance of these soluble ions. So what are some examples of ionic compounds? We have like hydroxyapatite. This is something we find in bone and tooth enamel. You will not have to memorize that, like the Ca10, PO4, like 6OH2, like any of that. But hydroxyapatite, yes. Again, this is something that is naturally found in your bone, naturally found in your tooth enamel. Calcium carbonate, right? This is going to be what's found in making the otoliths. This is going to be in your vestibular apparatus for you to determine basically your positional, your position, so balance, right, in your inner ear. And then the electrolytes, things like potassium ions, sodium ions, chloride ions, calcium ions, magnesium ions, those are super important for a lot of different processes. So we're going to see those ions come back over and over and over again, especially calcium and potassium and sodium. We'll see those come back tons of times throughout this class. We get to the covalent bonds. Again, it's sharing of electrons, right? We can share one pair of electrons, so a single bond. We can share two pairs of electrons, which is a double bond. Or we can share all the way up to 3 pairs of electrons, meaning we form a triple bond. And so here's just some examples of those. These covalent bonds are high energy bonds, meaning it's going to take energy to make the bonds. And when we break the bonds, it's going to release energy. The fact this idea of using energy to make bonds and releasing energy when we break them is vitally important to metabolism, to our ability to function as living things. We will see this making and breaking of bonds in terms of the capture or release of energy. We're going to see that several times over when we look at different processes, especially when we get to cell respiration. So here's just the different types of bonds. Here's just demonstrating single, double, and triple bonds. I'm not going to sit here and go too far into this because I already explained these, but if you'd like to pause here to take a peek, by all means, go ahead. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide. So earlier we said covalent bonds can be polar or non-polar, in that we're sharing electrons, right? If we're non-polar, the electrons are shared equally, right? It's like if you have a sibling, you go and you have to share a candy bar with them and you cut it right down the middle perfectly so you each get one perfect half of the candy bar. That would be a non-polar covalent bond. Non-polar substances are generally hydrophobic, meaning they do not like water. They have an aversion to water. So things that are hydrophobic do not mix very well in water. So think like oils, right? Like an olive oil with water. If you were to pour the two together and shake it up, you'd mix it a little bit, but given some time, they would totally separate from each other. Polar substances, when we have polarity, when we're a polar covalent bond, this means that we have what's called a partial charge. And this is because we share the electrons, but we don't equally share them. So if we look down at the bottom here, we see this little symbol, right, with the negative and the positive. That's showing that yes, the electrons are shared, but they're not shared perfectly equal. So if you think about the analogy with the candy bar that you have to share with your sibling, the polar covalent bond would be like if you cut a little bit of a bigger piece for yourself and you gave this slightly smaller piece to your sibling. You're still sharing the candy bar with your sibling, but you're keeping more of the candy bar for yourself instead. These substances tend to be hydrophilic, meaning they do like water and they mix well with water. And we'll see that things that are ionic, things that are polar, will mix very well with water. Things that are non-polar will not mix very well with water. And then lastly, we get into stereoisomers. These are going to be molecules that have the same atoms in the same sequence, but they are arranged a little differently. So like if we look over here, right, we see cis-2-butene and trans-2-butene. If we look at them here, we see that our methyl groups, right, are both on the same side. And so that's where the cis comes from because it's same side. Over here, we see our methyl groups are opposite of each other, and that's where trans comes in, right? It's opposite sides. So if we look at it, right, 1, 2, 3, 4 carbons, right? 1, 2, 3, 4 carbons. 3, 6, 7, 8 hydrogens. 3, 6, 7, 8 hydrogens. So it's C4H7 for both of them, but they're arranged a little bit differently. And that's the big thing with a stereoisomer, is that they have the same molecular, like, makeup, right, in terms of what atoms are present, but how they're organized is a little different. And then we see the same thing down here, right? This is just going left and right, so where our hydroxyl group is, right, on one side versus over here, that hydroxyl group is found on the opposite side. So that would be like an enantiomer. That's going to be an optical isomer, so left and right. So a good example of an enantiomer, if you're, well, or something that would help you visualize this, would be like your own hands, your left and your right hands. If you look at your left and right hands, they have the same basic setup, right? You have a thumb, you have 4 fingers, generally speaking, but you cannot lay them over the top of each other and have them perfectly line up. Right, if you put one hand on top of the other so that your palms are facing the same direction, you'll see that you'll have a pinky and a thumb on one side and your other pinky and thumb on the other side. The only way you can get them to match up is if you put your palms together. But if you do that, it's a mirror image. They're not identical. It's a mirror image of each other. And then lastly, we get to these hydrogen bonds. Again, these are weak pseudo bonds. So this is a big thing here that I want to point out very quickly. Hydrogen bonds do not form new molecules. When something is bound together with hydrogen bonds, it is not a new molecule. It is a weak bond, right? It is a weak bond that does not create a new molecule. So like in the picture here, we see 2 water molecules, right? H2O. They're bound together by that dotted line that shows the hydrogen bond. We would not call this H4O2, right? We would not do that. The dashed line indicates that this is a weak bond and that it is not creating a new molecule. These are still 2 separate water molecules. We just have a slight attraction to the from the opposite charges. So remember, water is polar, right? So the oxygens are slightly negative, the hydrogens are slightly positive. There will be a slight attraction between the oxygen and the hydrogens of different water molecules because of the partial charges. But it's not strong enough of an attraction to warrant any real long-term bonding. We can snap this and break this very easily. The way I like to describe it is if you were going to a party with your significant other. You're bonded to your significant other when you go to this party. But that's not going to stop you from talking to other people while you're there, right? Engaging with your friends, right? Maybe talking to somebody new. You're still going to do those things. But all of those bonds are relatively weak compared to the bond you have with your significant other. When the party's over, right, and it's time to go home, you're going to go home with your significant other. You're not going to go home with someone else, right? Not unless you want to have a lot of explaining to do, right? So all those little connections you made, talking with friends, meeting new people, those bonds can break very easily. You can break that off and go back to the relationship that you had without any real changes to it. That's kind of how I think of the hydrogen bonds, and that might be something that helps you visualize how the hydrogen bonds fit in this grand scheme. Now, hydrogen bonds, even though they are weak, they are mighty and extremely important. We use these to hold molecules together in certain configurations, such as the DNA base pairing we see. So hydrogen bonds are going to keep the 2 nitrogen-containing bases bound together, keeping the 2 strands of DNA in close contact with each other. We also use hydrogen bonds with water in terms of being able to basically use a water molecule to pull the rest of the water molecules around it. And so this is really important for living things. Even if we think about like a tree, being able to pull water from the roots and fight against gravity to pull water up towards the very tops of the trees. So hydrogen bonds are extremely important when it comes to living things. Another example of the importance of hydrogen bonds, even though they are weak, we use them with protein folding. So proteins are very sensitive in that they have to have a very specific shape to do the job that they do. And hydrogen bonds are going to be some of the bonds that help create this form or this 3-dimensional structure that allows the protein to work. So here we see 2 different types of protein folding in the secondary structure. We see the beta pleated sheet and we see the alpha helix, both of which are localized folding within a protein. The hydrogen bonds are going to be what allow for those alpha helices and beta sheets to form. Lastly, we get to water. Water is polar covalent, like we mentioned earlier, and this means it is fantastic biologically speaking. It's going to be able to dissolve things that are polar and ionic. It's also going to have a high heat capacity. Because of those hydrogen bonds that develop between the water molecules, every time we go to try to heat water up, it's going to, the heat, like as we apply it, the energy we apply is going to break those hydrogen bonds, but the hydrogen bonds are going to reform just as fast as they're breaking. This means water is resistant to temperature change. That's a huge thing, right? So think about like going to a beach. When you go to the beach and you walk on the sand barefoot in a hot day, that sand is going to feel really, really hot. But as soon as you get to the water feels cool. And the reason the water feels cool is the high heat capacity. Water can absorb a lot of energy without changing the temperature because of the hydrogen bonds between each of the molecules. We also see water playing a role in the catabolism and anabolism within our own cells. So catabolism, we think we are taking a large molecule and inserting water to break it into smaller pieces. So we have a big molecule we want to break into small parts. Anabolism is talking about taking small parts and building up to something bigger. What water does here is it will insert itself in between the components of that molecule to break it into smaller pieces. This is hydrolysis. Hydro, we think water, lysis, to split or to break. So we're using water to split or break this molecule down into smaller parts. Dehydration, synthesis, we think dehydrate, we're removing water, we're losing water to build something up, right? Synthesis, we build something. Water is also a great solvent for those electrolytes, proteins. It gives us a matrix to allow reactants to kind of collide with to form their products. So we see that it forms the liquid portion inside of our cells, the cytosol, so the internal cellular components. And then it also forms the liquid portion of the body fluids, so all of the interstitial fluids, the fluids found outside of the cells themselves. So water is extremely important. These are just a few things. There's other things that make water all like really important too, but we're not worried about those. We're worried about these. So again, like I mentioned with the water's ability to resist temperature change, it comes down to this network of hydrogen bonds formed between all the water molecules, right? So we have all these different hydrogen bonds where each individual bond is weak, but when we look at the sum of all the hydrogen bonds, it's relatively strong. Again, water is going to then be able to dissolve or solvate other polar molecules, so proteins, carbs, ionic compounds, salts, right? And so like things like the ions are pulled apart when they are dissolved. So that, like, let's say we're dissolving salt, we'll see individual sodium and chloride ions floating around in that water. If it's polar, it can dissolve because it's hydrophilic. Non-polar things will not dissolve in water, they're hydrophobic. Again, that's still pretty important to be hydrophobic because that's going to also help us kind of use water to create barriers like the plasma membrane of the cell. So we look at solvation. This is the ability of a solvent to dissolve a solute. When we're talking biology, our solvent is always water. So keep that in mind. So solvent, the water, dissolves a solute, like a salt or some other molecule, to form what's called a solution. So the solution is the water plus the solute together. As a solvent, water is essential. We're looking at about 60% of our body is made up of water, and that we use this, right, to dissolve all these different things so that we can move them around, we can transport them, we can create barriers, whatever it is we need to do. Now, the solutes we find in the body are well regulated. So the volume, the salt concentration of our body fluids, this is tightly controlled through homeostatic mechanisms. We'll talk about this when we get to the urinary system in particular.